Thank you for all coming. And I also want to thank Lou Frey, my colleague in Congress, for organizing this and giving us an opportunity to reflect, as Howard Baker said, on one of the most important political events of the past 30 years and probably one of the more important political events in our country's history. I'll start in a way like he did. I didn't expect to be sitting on impeachment of the President of the United States. In fact, I was just elected to the Congress in November before the whole question started, November 1972, and of course the impeachment, the Watergate started unraveling started in 1973. In 1972, in November, impeachment was so far from anyone's consciousness that I didn't even want to go on the House Judiciary Committee. In fact, my first effort was to try to get off the House Judiciary Committee to make sure I wasn't on the House Judiciary Committee, and I lost. And I said, this is very troublesome, my first congressional effort, and I lose, and I put on the House Judiciary Committee. I was a very unhappy camper at the beginning of my congressional career. So all of a sudden, then I was thrust in the middle of history when impeachment started. I also never dreamed, as the daughter of immigrant parents, that I would have the opportunity, the privilege, the burden, the responsibility of sitting in judgment on a President of the United States. I think that something like that can only happen in America, where everyone is given an opportunity. In fact, you don't even know what those opportunities are likely to turn out to be. I want to say that, just to broaden the debate, that impeachment was not just about the break-in at Watergate, and it was not just about the cover-up of that break-in at the Watergate Hotel. The impeachment articles were about three things. First, the first article of impeachment was about basically obstruction of justice. In other words, it was kind of like an indictment, as though you were writing a criminal indictment of the President. And it seemed very much in that mode. The second article of impeachment had to do with the President's abuse of power. It was a condemnation of the President for using the powers of his office in a way contrary to the Constitution, contrary to the rule of law, and as we said in the article, he failed to take care that the laws were faithfully executed. Some of those articles, some of the content of the abuse of power article had to do with illegal wiretaps, had to do with the misuse of federal agencies, such as getting the CIA to obstruct an FBI investigation. Some of it had to do with misuse of the IRS, having the IRS conduct audits of people who were either political enemies or people about whom the President wanted information for political purposes. This is the kind of thing that was involved in Article 2. And by the way, I should say it won the most number of votes. And the third article had to do with the President's failure to respond to the House Judiciary Committee's impeachment inquiry subpoenas. Let me just say that in my judgment, humble judgment, I think the impeachment effort of the House Judiciary Committee worked. It has passed the test of time so far for 30 years, although I'm sure that there will be ambitious scholars who will dig deeply into what we did and try to find nefarious purposes in our actions. But so far, it has withstood the test of time. Indeed, by the time that the process finished, although the committee vote was not unanimous on impeachment, but subsequent revelations of presidential tape recordings converted the holdout Republican members And so ultimately, there was a statement by all the members of the House Judiciary Committee that they supported the impeachment of the President of the United States. It was totally bipartisan. And there were some very conservative members and very strong defenders of the President. So the evidence was really overwhelming that the President engaged in conduct that met the standard of Article I, in my judgment, Article II as well. Let me also say why I believe the process has withstood the test of time. First of all, the process tried to be fair. It tried to be fair to the President. It tried to be fair to the members of Congress. It tried to be fair to the American public. To the President's counsel was allowed to sit in on our deliberations, was allowed to present briefs, was allowed to cross-examine witnesses. The chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Peter Odino, made a very wise decision, which was basically to bend over backwards and not create any issues so that someone could say the process wasn't fair. President didn't have an opportunity to have his say. President didn't have an opportunity to have his point of view expressed or advanced. I think that was very important. In addition, the House Judiciary Committee adopted a procedure that was designed to make sure that the members understood what they were doing. Now, sometimes I know Congress isn't always held in high repute, and we were literally force-fed facts and information. What do I mean? We were given big black books with summaries of evidence. We had to go, these books were secret. We had to lock them in our safes at night. And every day we would sit there, and I'm sure Tom Railsback will remember this as well. We would sit, and the members of the House Judiciary Committee staff would go over statements of evidence with us. And we had the opportunity, it was a paragraph, okay? It wasn't a volume, it was a paragraph. And then they'd produce the supporting evidence, and we had the opportunity to challenge that, to cross-examine that, to question that, and of course to understand that. We went through many, many volumes of these books. And so by the end of that process, all of us understood what the evidence was. All of us had a chance to question the staff, to attack the evidence, to make sure that it could withstand public scrutiny. But of course, we had to understand it first. And so that process was a meticulous process. I also want to point out, too, in terms of fairness, normally the Democrats have a Democratic counsel and the Republicans have a Republican counsel. Here, there were two Republican counsels. The Democrats had a Republican, John Doerr, and the Republicans had a Republican, Alfred Jenner. I also want to say that the other reason that there was such an emphasis on fairness was because what precedent did we have? Our only precedent was the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. And the impeachment of Andrew Johnson really had a stench throughout history because everyone felt it was entirely partisan, that it was entirely political, it wasn't rooted in any facts, it was just an effort to remove a president for political reasons. We were all, I think, very much aware of the judgment that history would make on us. And rightfully so, because remember, impeachment is the removal of a president. We have a democracy. President is democratically elected by majority vote. And we learn that, okay, we accept the result of the majority. Now, a Congress is going to say to the American people, your vote doesn't count. We're going to remove a president. The Constitution gives that power. But that power has to be used in a way that's judicious and fair because all of it's an awesome responsibility for us in Congress, in the House Judiciary Committee, to say we're overturning the results of a democratic election. And so we were very conscious of history, how history would judge us, at least I felt that, and we were very conscious of how the American people would judge us, and we were very conscious of how awesome the task was and how careful we had to be, doubly careful, triply careful, before we ever overturned the decision of a majority of the American voters. And remember, Richard Nixon was elected in one of the biggest landslides in history. I think the other reason that this process withstood the test of time was that ultimately it was a bipartisan process. Peter Odino understood that the American people and history would never accept a process that was won by a majority of the Democratic vote. Remember, at that time, it was a democratically controlled Congress, and it was a democratically controlled House Judiciary Committee. I mean, controlled in the sense that there was a majority of Democrats in the House and a majority of Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee. Peter Rodino understood that if he just had Democrats and no Republicans, the American people would never accept the verdict of impeachment. And rightfully so. If we couldn't persuade fair-minded people of both parties of the evidence, then how could we persuade the American people, and how could we persuade history? And so Peter Rodino conducted a process that included the Republicans, and in the end, there was Republican support, not just one or two, but we had 6 Republicans supporting the first article of impeachment, 7 Republicans supporting the second article of impeachment, and as I said, when the additional tapes were disclosed, all Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee said that they would support impeachment. The evidence was so overwhelming. Let me also say that the other reason that the process, I think, has withstood the test of time is that the process wasn't started by Congress. It was started by the American people. A number of us were very anxious after the revelations of the Senate Watergate Committee, Howard Baker and Senator Ervin, and with regard, there were some revelations in the summer about secret bombing of Cambodia, which was some of us in Congress, at least I did, felt was unconstitutional. And there were other matters that had become public, and people were very, very concerned about, let's think about starting an impeachment process. But the Congress did not start it. Nothing happened, basically, until the Saturday Night Massacre. I'm sure some of you don't know what that was, so let me just tell you. Archibald Cox was a special prosecutor who had been appointed to investigate Watergate from a criminal point of view. He subpoenaed tapes from the White House after it became public that there was a taping system. The White House refused to turn over the tapes. Archibald Cox, who was a professor at Harvard Law School, went to court to require the president to turn over the tapes. The appellate court had just ruled that the president had to turn over those tapes. And ultimately, as we know, those tapes were damning, totally damaging, showed the president's complete involvement in the Watergate cover-up, and triggered his resignation. So the president made a lot of sense early in hindsight as to why the president didn't want them disclosed. And so what the president did, because he knew that it would be very, very bad to face an order of a court that said, you've got to turn over the tapes, and he said, no, I'm not going to obey the order of a court. That could have been terrible, and that itself could have led to an impeachment inquiry. The president fired Archibald Cox, fired him. Well, that created a firestorm in America. People are not accustomed to having someone tell the prosecutor what to do. We believe there's an independent system of justice, that prosecutors have to make their decisions in a way according to the rule of law, and a president can't dictate the investigation of his subordinates. That is what triggered the impeachment inquiry in the House of Representatives. And so we weren't taking, as it were, the situation into our own hands, which some of us had urged earlier, but we're responding instead, after October 20th, to this firestorm demanding that the Congress act in response to the president's firing of Archibald Cox and his effort to, what seemed to the country and to many of us, to protect his people who were going to be subject to prosecution and conviction if there were a full and thorough investigation of Watergate. Those were the, I think, key factors that made the public respond. Let's say, probably initially there was some skepticism, but in the end, respond favorably to what the House Judiciary Committee did. I just want to throw in one other point, and that is that the committee hearings were televised. That was very unusual for those times, and there was a lot of debate in the House Judiciary Committee, initially among the Democrats. I don't know how the Republicans responded to that, but ultimately the committee voted to have the hearings televised. Why was that important? Because I think the public could get to see on television what my demeanor was, what my arguments were. Did I sound fair? Did I sound like a hysterical, anti-Nixon person? What about Tom Railsback? Did he sound fair? What were his arguments like? And I think people could scrutinize us and determine whether this process was a railroad process or whether this was a fair process. So I think all those factors helped. I just want to say, though, that even though, in my judgment, impeachment worked and the result was the correct result, it took a lot to get there, and a lot of things that could have gone very differently. And mostly the reason it got there was because of some very courageous people who did what was not expected of them. For example, it took two very courageous reporters on the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein, to uncover some very important facts that suggested the president himself or his top aides were involved in the Watergate cover-up. Now, you know, there are a lot of other people who were looking for a story there, but maybe it took young people who didn't have a sense of precedent, who were courageous, to do that. Who was a second figure here who made a huge difference? Judge Sirica, John Sirica, a very conservative Republican judge who sat on the trial of the burglars at Watergate. He sensed that something was fishy. He sensed that the whole story wasn't coming out. And some of you may remember that there was hush money and an effort to keep the burglars from saying that there were any higher-ups involved. And so Sirica, a conservative Republican, said, there's something fishy here, and I'm going to suggest the imposition of very tough sentences, and maybe somebody's going to break and tell the truth. Well, John McCord, one of the burglars, confessed that there were higher-ups involved. So that, if we'd had a different judge, might not have happened. Archibald Cox. True, he's a Democrat, but it took a lot of guts to stand toe-to-toe with the President of the United States and say, I want the evidence. Also, it took a lot of guts for two Republicans, Elliot Richardson, the Attorney General of the United States, and William Ruckelshaus, the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, two Republicans, resigned when Richard Nixon fired Archibald Cox. They were honorable people, and they felt that they'd given their word to the U.S. Senate that the investigation on Watergate would be conducted by a special prosecutor, and they felt that they could no longer remain there if the person they had picked had been fired. Then you're talking about honorable people on the Senate Watergate Committee. Sam Ervin, obviously a Democrat, but Howard Baker, who, as you heard, said he started off believing that this was all concocted by the Democrats. But when the president said Mitchell might be involved, he kept an open mind. And keeping an open mind, despite the politics, is really an act of great courage, and I have enormous respect for him, and the country owes him an enormous debt of gratitude. Peter Rodino, a brand new chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. Nobody knew what he was going to do. But his decision, as a Democrat, not to railroad this through, but to bring Republicans with us, was a key decision. And then the Southern Democrats on the committee and the Republicans on the committee who voted for impeachment. It was not easy for them. Their districts had voted overwhelmingly for Richard Nixon. They were worried that they would have to pay a political price. The rest of us were worried about history and how we would be judged and whether we were, in our own consciences, doing the right thing, but we weren't taking a political risk. For them, it was a political risk. And so their courage counted. So, in a way, you had to have all these things working. You had to have people of courage all the way throughout this system who, regardless of party or personal predilection, stood up and did the right thing. And in addition to that, you had a U.S. Supreme Court that voted unanimously to allow the tapes, to require the tapes to be disclosed. The head of the Chief Justice had been appointed by Richard Nixon. Another justice had been appointed by Richard Nixon. But they put party aside, and they voted unanimously. It takes a lot. It takes a lot, as it should, for this to happen. But it took people of courage, and there were people of courage throughout the process. I would just say briefly, to my mind, the only failure of the impeachment process, and sort of the issue was alluded to by one of the first speakers here, was that it did not address foreign policy. There were issues related to the Cambodia bombing. In fact, it was leaks about the Cambodia bombing that triggered the formation of the Plumbers Unit, and that triggered wiretaps that were illegal. But the committee stayed away from it. And the question might be raised, would there have been constraints on other illegal actions, possibly not by presidents, but by their staffs, and we know that happened in Iran-Contra, and it may have happened subsequent to that, if the committee had acted on these issues? That's the one area that we did not address, and probably because it would have made the actions of the Judiciary Committee seem very political. But failing to address abuses of foreign policy means that somehow the lesson has not been clearly given to future generations. But it was a privilege to be on the committee, and it's a privilege to be here today. Thank you.
I want to give you, you're all, not all of you, a lot of you are young, very young, like my kids and frankly, my grandkids. I want to give you a feel for what it was like for a Republican on the House Judiciary Committee. Before I do, I want to say I think Congressman Luke Frey has done a wonderful job in setting up this institute, and also all the other things that he has done for the former members of Congress to make them a factor in campus visits to educate people all over the country. Luke Frey, I can't say enough. I also want to say I admired Richard Nixon. I thought he was smart. He had campaigned for me twice. I liked him. He was a little bit distant, kind of hard to get close to. And I knew Julie Eisenhower, Nixon, who I really liked a lot and had gotten to know her. Anyway, I admired Nixon because of what he had done in opening the doors to mainland China, and also the SALT Treaty, where he established a détente with the Soviet Union that was long overdue. But having said all of that, there was a stupid Watergate break-in that when we heard about it, we couldn't imagine people as smart as the people in the Nixon White House would be involved in a third-rate burglary to bug, as Lou said, the Democratic headquarters where you're not going to learn anything anyway. I mean, it was stupid. It didn't go anywhere. There was one impeachment resolution introduced by Father Bob Drinan, a liberal Democrat from Massachusetts, and it didn't go anywhere. Didn't go anywhere. But with the, as Liz said, with the revelation of the tapes, which were voice-activated in the White House, and with the Urban Committee conducting hearings and Alex Butterfield revealing that there were taped conversations, and then the urban people wanting the tapes, and by then there was a special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, wanted the tapes. All of a sudden, what had been a third-rate burglary became a real cause. I told Lou, I went home in the winter of 1973 after it had been determined there would be an impeachment inquiry. When I went home for the Christmas holidays, I was followed home by Sam Donaldson, an ABC news crew. I was followed home by Ike Pappas and a CBS news crew, and I wondered what the hell was going on. At that time, there was no cable television. We didn't have continuous reporting, of news, no 24-hour news. So I go back home and talk to my youngest daughter's, her number 3 daughter's grade school class on politics, and there's Sam Donaldson. I go speak to the Republican women up in Whiteside County. There's Sam Donaldson and Ike Pappas, and then NBC News called and asked if they could send a film crew. I had been targeted as being from a Democratic district. I defeated the Democrat, and to crown it all, I go to the Moline Rock Island, this is Illinois, Moline Rock Island basketball game where it's hard to get seats. I'm sitting way up in the, way up high in the seats watching this big ball game between the two rivals, and Sam Donaldson is filming us watch the ball game. Well, nobody's scoring. So I tell our neighbors that are sitting up there, I said, let's all clap and pretend someone scored. And then I see Sam down filming the pom-pom girls. And anyway, I became a pretty good friend of Sam Donaldson. Well, that was a prelude as to what was going to happen. I went back to Washington. We started meeting. I helped select Bert Jenner, who was the Republican consul and had been very active in the ABA. And anyway, I would have 20 interviews waiting about, every time we did anything. And I wouldn't tell anybody anything. I would tell them, I got a call from Catherine Graham of the Washington Post to have dinner with her and 5 other people. Bob Woodward took me out to dinner 4 times, trying to pump me about what we were going to do. And at the very end, Walter Flowers, a dear friend, a Democrat, a conservative Democrat from Alabama who'd been head of the student council at Alabama, came over to me and said, Rails, let's get our guys together. So I got Hamilton Fish, Bill Cohn, the guy that I was playing paddleball with, a Republican, Caldwell Butler from Virginia. He got Jim Mann, and Ray Thornton, that would later become the chancellor of the University of Arkansas. Jim Mann was ordered to quit at, I think it was South Carolina. Bill Cohen, as I mentioned, went on to become Republican Secretary of Defense under Bill Cohen. I felt I was in good company. We started meeting. There'd been lots of fights about the role Jim St. Clair should have. Should Jim St. Clair be able to question witnesses? At one point, he wasn't going to be able to. The Republicans raised hell. We fought about subpoena power, who can issue the subpoenas to whom. But then we listened to the tapes, and I spent hours listening to the tapes, as did all the other members. And I came reluctantly to the conclusion that when I got into the tapes involving hush money and paying, not the president himself, but some of his top people talking about we've got to come up with money for Howard Hunt and for the convicted people that have broken into the headquarters. And when I heard about the talk about an enemies list, and when I heard about Better Tell Calmback, who was the president's finance guy that John Dean is singing, I heard enough on the tape to lead me to believe we had to hold the president to account. What an impeachment is not a trial. It's like a grand jury proceeding where you're saying there's probable cause that these offenses were committed. Only in our case, and I give Peter Rodino credit, they raised the standard that there had to be clear and convincing evidence that an offense had been committed. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, it was a real ordeal, and I'll never forget when the votes took place in the House Judiciary Room on the first article. And I was the first Republican to say aye. I was one sad guy, and I think even Peter Rodino, who I like, tried to be fair, even though we had a lot of arguments. I think he was very close to tears. So anyway, I disagree with Liz. I want to get this in. When they talk about the Cambodian incursion as being an article of impeachment, read David Halberstam's book, The Best and the Brightest. Read Arthur Schlesinger's book, The Imperial Presidency. Look at the Pentagon Papers that were revealed, and you will see that other presidents, Richard Nixon was the culmination of the imperial presidency. Other presidents were doing things that were bad, only they weren't stupid enough to have a voice-actuated tape. Thank you.